Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Friday afternoon, it's like 4:30, it's like the best time to focus on a conference presentation, I think. So I'm glad y'all made some time to be here. I'm going to talk to you about another COVID era project, and one that was really seriously kind of complicated by COVID. This was a project, one of those things that we hoped would be just like a 1 semester, maybe 1.5 semester project that stretched over 2 years. As a result of everything that happened, and still didn't quite do everything that we hoped that it would, but I think still provided some interesting insights into some of the same questions that Emily actually just talked about. There's a lot of parallels. It was a good setup for what we're about to talk about. So we're going to go from a bigger metropolitan area, Boston, Massachusetts, to Athens, Georgia. Athens, Georgia is a college town. It's on the very outskirts of Atlanta, but it's not a suburb. 120,000 people who are mainly interested in football and what to do on a Friday night, and higher education as well. So it's great to talk about the town where I live. So before I get started, this was a group project. There's community partners involved. So I'm going to start on the bottom. I had several other folks at University of Georgia who helped. Doug Pardue was actually also part of BikeAthens, which was the main community partner in this case, as well as Allison Smith, who's another faculty member at UGA. And then I had 3 different students involved in this project as research assistants. Regina Nasrallah, Emily Castillo, and Olivia Gilliam all helped. Emily and Olivia started this project in fall 2020. It was a tough time, man, to be an undergraduate student, and by the end of the year, they were really dragging. So it was great to have their participation and their perseverance through all of this. Our community partners was the primary partner here was a group called BikeAthens, which, as the name suggests, supports biking in Athens. And Scott Long and Jason Perry were our 2 contacts there. Also had some interactions with Daniel Sizemore in Athens, Clark County, as well as the GIS office, kind of generally. So the goal here was we wanted to map some bike routes in the city of Athens. And you might ask, why do we want to do that? Because there are a lot of platforms already where you can find where to go biking in a city. You can go to Strava and find the bike routes that people have set up for, I want a challenging ride, and ooh, this looks fun, I'm going to go do this today. Right? You want to go from point A to point B. If I wanted to bike from Athens, Georgia to Minneapolis, Minnesota, I could just put that in Google Maps and it'll give me a route, right? So why do that, right? Why do we need a separate map? And the answer is, I think those 2 tools, and we talked a lot about this, I'll come back to this point. Those two tools, or those kinds of tools, provide biking as kind of this isolated single instance event. It's for an individual rider, for an individual user, right? Versus something that gives a more systemic kind of view and helps you think about the whole kind of system of roads and biking options in the city. I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm sure there's some of y'all might have published on this. About the ways that the shift from kind of reference maps to Google Maps has changed the way that we think about the process of mapping, of looking at a system and trying to diagram your way through it, right? It's just a different perspective on the system, and I think it pushes the conversation in different kinds of ways. I think the bike route map that you're going to see at the end of this presentation allows us to incorporate contextual features like terrain or traffic in ways that some of these other tools might not. And I also think that these maps work as publicity tools, right? The maps that you see here aren't going to get shared by an organization. I mean, maybe a Strava route could, here's our selected routes or curated routes, but it's not as easy to market as a single map, right? You can't kind of present that or work with that with users in quite the same way, as well as kind of organize around how to make a city more bikeable, as you'll see. So what we were doing here, and we sat down, Regina, the first student that I had, sat down with Scott, who's the director of BikeAthens, at a coffee shop in the before times. It was something like August or September 2019. It was a charmed moment. And we said, what are some things that might be helpful for you? And what Scott mentioned was to update this map that they had of bike routes in Athens. And so this is the city of Athens. You've got all the streets on here. You've got all of them color-coded by kind of safety or risk level, which I think is basically a proxy for speed limit. You've got a DEM kind of topo map underneath that, and then some points of interest as well. Right? And they had done this in 2010. They still had a whole box of them sitting in the back of their office, and they were like, we do not want another print map. But we do want a map that's maybe a little more updated and could be potentially more useful, and maybe things have changed since then. So I said, okay, we'll take that on. We looked around, we tried to find some models of maps. A couple that we liked in particular were like this one. This is of Vancouver. Some of you might be familiar with these maps. It really does, I think, a really effective job at highlighting kind of the main arterials for biking throughout the city. So those green and yellow lines are like their preferred routes. It's almost like the transit network throughout the city. Right, in terms of the way that it's set up, and it's got pretty clear delineations of other kinds of bike infrastructure throughout the city that you can look at as well. So as a print map, we like that. There's this other one on for Portland that we looked at that we liked quite a bit because it's got quite a few things on here. Their taxonomy was a little complicated to follow, but they do have like dangerous intersections, I believe, which are these red circles. These little black dots here are where there's challenging slopes, things like that. Almost all the online maps that we looked at were hosted on ArcGIS Online. That's where we went in the end. And that's just because that's the platform that seems to be easiest to use and most effective for a lot of these agencies to use. So let's talk about our design process. So the first thing we did is try to think through that question of map style, right? And so we considered, say, like a route map, which was like, what if we had like 20 routes that were like the bus lines throughout the city, but these are bike routes, and we could just kind of custom design these. But like, I think that just didn't feel very practical, like paging through all these and trying to put them all together, that just didn't work. We thought about doing maybe kind of like a subway or transit style map, but we were worried that was a little too abstract. To do something that was too fuzzy like that. So we decided to just go kind of with a conventional map in terms of what we were looking at. We did a survey of folks at BikeAthens, members of BikeAthens, of like, what are the main factors that you care about in terms of bikeability? We collected data that was relevant to the factors that they identified. And then that was contextual data for us. That was primarily used in kind of road rating and road evaluation. To generate the actual route network itself, we used APIs. So we used the Google Mapbox and Here APIs to generate routing paths throughout the city, try to identify what are some potential kind of main network ideas. We also used Strava to supplement that to some extent as well. Then we created the suggested routes from all that information and got some community input on that, and we have a final, very much for now, version. This is probably something we'll want to come back to in a year or two and keep working with. So that's also happens to be kind of the format of this presentation. So let me run through the points here. So what factors mattered to Athens bikers? We had the survey. I mentioned Regina before. She developed a survey and hung out on their open bike nights for a few weeks and asked people to fill it out. And some of the options we thought about were things like elevation change, dangerous intersections, bike infrastructures, bike repair stations, bike racks, all those kinds of things. You might think, as someone who's probably rode a bike at some point in your life, which of these seem most important to you? We ended up with 3 pretty clear winners, which were these: elevation change, speed limit of surrounding traffic, and bike lanes on the road. We also did kind of ask a little bit about, and I forgot to put this on here, percent of the street covered by shade. Being someone who's not a native southerner, I thought that might be important in the summertime. People were like, no, it's fine. So like, that was not the thing that stood out. It's these 3 things: elevation change, speed limit, and whether or not there is bike lanes. All of which kind of matter to like the difficulty of the ride and the safety of the ride. Those were the main things that stood out to folks. So for that first one, looking at elevation change, how did we measure that? Again, I'm sure there's multiple ways to kind of do this. What we did was to take the existing road network and chop it up into uniform segments of 75 meters in length, right? And we measured the beginning and end point of each of those segments, did some simple trigonometry. What was the elevation at the beginning using a fine scale DEM elevation model, terrain model? What was the elevation at the beginning, elevation at the end? What's the change for that little road segment? And then calculate an angle. From that. For that little road segment, what was the average change in elevation? Generally, that's expressed as a percentage, so things that were over 5 or 10% are generally seen as being fairly challenging. We went back and forth on like mean versus max, like what all fits with that. I think mean is what max is what we ended up settling on. In this case. And so this was one step toward kind of identifying where those spots where elevation is really an issue. That 75 meters was something that kind of came through trial and error as well. These numbers are always somewhat arbitrary, but it's what proved most useful. So when Regina was done with her project, she kind of, originally we were thinking of doing this like challenge and safety score. So there's a challenge score, which is about kind of change in elevation, and safety, which is more like kind of a speed limit map. This is for all the roads in the city. This was kind of confusing. You can look at it, it's kind of confusing. And it, like actually doing all roads in some ways I think is counterproductive, because like, which one should I use? Like it's too many choices, right? It's another spaghetti problem in terms of what we're looking at here. So we shifted instead to a preferred routes map. And so we wanted to say, here are the roads that basically BikeAthens is kind of endorsing. Like here's where the bike paths should go throughout the city, or where bikers, especially the ones new to the city, which were the ones we were kind of targeting with this map, might highlight. And so then the question is, well, do we want to sit down and manually draw out a bunch of routes through the city? That sounds like it would be really long and really kind of boring. Let's not do that. So what we did instead was say we generated a set of points. It was about 700 points of interest, I believe, in total throughout the city. And so this is like restaurants and coffee shops and schools and parks and all this kind of stuff. And then we did this process of generating 1,500 routes, random routes, that were across different school zones. So we used school attendance zones as kind of our strata. In here, and said, okay, we've got 1,500 random routes. Let's run those routes through 3 different routing APIs and see what they do for us. So we used Google Maps, we used here, and we used Mapbox, all 3 of them. And this, it was interesting. So I didn't know what to expect. Some of y'all might have had a better idea. They were different, right? So here's this is a heat map of where they ended up taking us. So we looked at kind of frequency at which these routes showed up at different points throughout the city. And the one, like, they're all different. So like, let's start with this red box down here, right? Mapbox, kind of, this is, I think, Millage Avenue going down this way. Here, like, avoids that street entirely, right? And it goes down like this other route, which I have to look and see and zoom in and see what that was. And then Google does something really funky here. I'm not sure what this is. But it's 3 different approaches to that same area. All of them have kind of a single road. The thing that mattered more to us in the end is that if you look at this part of Athens in the green box, which is closer to downtown, oops, I forgot that I'm over here. This green box that's closer to downtown, right? 3 different solutions here. This is a much denser area. Both here and Google tended to prioritize kind of what we might think of as more arterial or central streets. There was kind of one route that it wanted to take. The Mapbox API, and some of you might know why this is, was more likely to identify side streets as a route. And when we talked with the folks that we were working with, they're like, that does sound like kind of the better solution. That's the thing we want to go at, because some of those arterial streets, and we'll come back to this, are problematic for bike riding for reasons you might well imagine. So what we ended up doing was starting with the Mapbox version of routes as kind of a main map. We kind of filtered that down, made it look prettier, snapped it to the existing road network as well as we could, and used that as the jumping off point, and then went through and did some fine tuning from that. One of the other things that we did do, we do not have a Strava subscription and we did not have a budget for one, but we do have the ability to screenshot. So we went into the Strava heat map and took screenshots of the Strava heat maps of ridership throughout Athens, Clarke County, and georeferenced them, mosaicked them together, and created this map. I know, it's great. It was great. Actually, the student who did this was really proud of it. She was really, Emily, really enjoyed doing this. And so we ended up with this map, and it was interesting because it did really confirm the use of side streets. There's some things that really popped from here. One of the things that was interesting, though, that I'm going to point out, we had this discussion. There's several routes on here that aren't technically routes, right? They're like, here's a dirt path to the side of the freeway that some people use as a cut through. And we were like, oh, we should include that. This is like great knowledge that we're getting through Strava. And the people at BikeAthens were like, no. We're not taking liability for anybody taking any of these routes, right? We're going to stick with the established streets in this case. And so we had those on there and we took them off, but I think it was still helpful kind of confirmation for understanding things. You can also see things like here, this bright shining star here is where there's a bunch of bike trails. It's a park, Trail Creek Park. This is another little area where people are doing more recreational biking kinds of stuff. Oh, see, this is casualty of not being in person. Okay, I'm not on Zoom. Yeah, this one right here and this one right here, right? So this is Trail Creek Park right over here, right? In terms of what we're looking at. Okay, so we use some Strava. Let's keep going. So then we end up with this map. Here is our actual kind of official first draft with people. Am I fine on time? Am I good? Okay, thanks. And so, we used the routes from Mapbox. We went through and rated them. Those were primarily based on speed, though we did do some kind of manual calculation with that. This map also includes, this is a print map, by the way. This is not the official one. This was the routes as a print map for people to scribble on, which was the next step. We've got some multi-use paths and trails that we pulled in from the city. That's the ACC data, essentially, and then those other routes are ours. And we tried to mark some of them with bike lanes as well. And you'll see there's some green and some red and other stuff on there. So I'm going to highlight 3 points of feedback we got on this because I think it's relevant to kind of this task. So the first is what to do about arterials. So let's talk about, this is a street called Westlake Drive in Athens, Georgia. It is this street that goes from here to here. It was not on our original map because it's like 45, 50 miles an hour. You can see here, if you're a biker, there's not much of a shoulder to rely on. It's pretty curvy. So those are all things that don't tend to make you feel super safe when you're on there. But we had this discussion. There was a night, this was in like February of 2021, and BikeAthens had kind of shut down for obvious reasons and was starting to open up again. We all had pizza. We were sitting outside talking about this, and we were talking about it, and they're like, well, I don't think anybody should go on there unless they want to risk their lives, but still, it feels like we have to include it because it is something that's on there, and how should we represent that? Right? So if you remember this map, the symbology that we had gone with originally was just having we had some arterials that were like, okay, I know you have to bike here, but you really shouldn't have to. And then we just have them as red, right? And it's like, they were like, that's not strong enough. So what we did actually was settled on like red dashed line. So we added a texture on there to recognize, and we changed it from use with caution to like, I forget what the final term was, something like, use only when necessary, but it was something like that, right? You can look at the final map legend. But we basically said like, what we wanted to do is not show it, because in some ways that let the city off the hook. They wanted to include it with the intention of saying, hey, look, this is the only way to kind of get from here to here. This is the place here, but this is not okay, what's here right now, and to kind of frame that as part of a broader conversation about transit going forward. The second thing was highlighting dangerous intersections. So this was something that you might expect. So there were some people who were like, this should really not be green, it should be orange. This is an intersection at Oglethorpe Avenue right by a cool pizza place called Automatic Pizza because it is Athens, Georgia, home of REM, so we have Automatic Pizza. And so this was a place where this is a pretty busy street, Prince Avenue here, and we changed it from green to orange as a result of that community input. And then there's also the question of bike lanes. So Athens is, and I don't know this is isolated for small towns, but Athens is kind of a small town. And so we were trying to say, well, we want to know where the bike lanes are. We emailed with the city, GIS folks, and this is kind of the response, which is basically, we have no idea. We have a layer, but really, if you could actually help us to do that data collection and figure out where the bike lanes are, we'd really appreciate that, right? And so and then it was like, maybe I can try to figure out how to do something, but ArcGIS like crashed and we lost a bunch of data, and 6 months later we finally got a file with this. But like the city doesn't know where the bike lanes are, right? And you'd think they would know. And so this was a whole nother challenge of like, we want to get this information on here, but we didn't have the capacity to go out and map every bike lane in the city or things like that. So I mean, we have what we have on there, but that's part of the work in progress. So the final map looks something like this as an ArcGIS online map. I think it was Olivia, the other student, who did a Mapbox base layer. So we've got a kind of a custom base layer that kind of minimizes the amount of other contrast that's going on there. It includes the routes. You can see these dotted red lines here for the you do this if you want to die kind of roads. And I shouldn't make light of that because there have been several fatal bike accidents in Athens. So it's a real danger. It's got the routes rated. Generally you want to stay on the green routes. These little arrows here represent where there's a slope of over 8%, is what we settled on as things here. So if you want to think about not wanting to huff and puff when it's 95 and humid outside, that's what you want to pay attention to. And then these little orange dots are bus stops. And we pulled in bus stops later. So folks who are thinking about bikes as kind of a last mile solution, we wanted to include that as well. So takeaways, because I need to wrap up. that mapping bikeability is a challenging task that draws on multiple data sources like topography, infrastructure, traffic data, and riders' experiences. That I think it's certainly more challenging than I thought it would be when we started to kind of pull this information in and think about how to process it and make it usable for a broad audience. Data availability, things like bike lanes can be inconsistent, and that's something you have to factor into a project when you're working from this, and that mapping these variables presents cartographic challenges similar to what we talked about before. There's a lot of information on these maps potentially, and you have to think about how to balance providing enough contextual information with making it not overwhelming for folks who are not professional GIS scientists. The second to last one I think is the most important to me out of this process. We talk a lot in community gauge research how the process is sometimes more important than the product, and that this process of talking about this, I think, highlighted awareness of gaps in infrastructure, or created conditions to begin to think about more things like, we started talking about things like signage around designated bike routes around the city, which is a relatively simple intervention, and say, what if we just put signs up that said, this is a route that the city is prioritizing and maybe eventually invests in some ways. That a project like this creates the condition for further collaboration in the future. And lastly, we had hoped to do much more with public input on this, but our partner, BikeAthens, basically kind of closed up their public shop for about a year and a half. And so it just made it really difficult to do outreach. And so we worked with folks as best we could, but it was not, I think, what we had originally hoped for. And that's just the way 2020 and 2021 went in that case. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much. I appreciate sharing this project with y'all.
Are there any questions from the audience? Okay.
Oh, wow.
1, 2, 3.
I'm bracing myself.
What kind of symbology do you use for dangerous intersections?
Dangerous intersections are not, so what we've done so far, I think what we will probably have is something like that is basically the next stage. That's one of those, we couldn't get enough community input yet on it. What we did so far is downgrade the road segment that goes into that intersection. So that was our kind of basic solution starting off with, was like, here's some places where like, yeah, you don't want to go there, and so we changed that from a green to an orange, right? Things like that. I think eventually it'd be great on an interactive map to have some kind of like exclamation, all the standard symbology that you might think, exclamation marks, something red that says like, beware, beware. I think that's just something where that to me is 2.0 of this map. So it's a good question.
Good talk. This is also probably going to be a 2.0 question, but when you ended up getting this data, I know you said that the city originally didn't have it, but
yeah.
What was the synopsis on the different types of barriers on the sides of the bike lanes or lack thereof?
Yeah, so there's like sharrows or separated bike lanes or things like this. And Athens is not, again, we are a smaller city. So basically what we have is like sharrows. We have striped bike lanes. They are just starting, so there's like the one downtown. This one, I mean, this is about this street's actually not bad because they're using there's car parking here. I'm not doing this, so they actually have the cars as a barrier. This is Hancock downtown, which was not on the city's bike map layer when I received it, because it was put in 2019 and they hadn't updated it. They have that. They're doing a test road diet right now that they're putting in some physical separators, but for the most part, it's just striping is all they've got. And so for us, there's no real point in differentiating. I do think that there is some push toward what do we even consider to be a bike lane? Is striping even enough to merit putting down on there, or if there's not some other kind of physical separator on there? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think in a bigger city, a city with more like Minneapolis, that's a good question. For Athens, it's a hard one. Yeah.
The presentation is really good. And I have this question, when you were talking about the splitting of line segments.
Yes.
You told us you split up 75-meter line segments.
Yes.
And how did you extract the start and end points of elevation? What was the procedure behind it? Because I think it's the data you have is too much, and is it like code? Did you code anything? Or is it
Yes. So this was a combination of R and QGIS in ways that I would have to go back and examine because some features worked better in QGIS and some things work. It's primarily in R though. And so you can segmentize roads, you can chop them into set lengths, and then I think it might be in QGIS you can extract start and end points of every line segment. So you take those road segments, you chop them into 75 meters, export them, pull into QGIS, identify start and end points and coordinates, and what their elevation, and then bring them back, what's their elevation based on a DEM of the start point and end point, and then you can do all the math from there.
Is it like the code is shared on GitHub?
It is, I believe there is code on GitHub.
Okay.
Have you seen the GitHub repo? You might be like the one person who has. There is a GitHub repo. I'll double check on that.
Sure.
Yeah, there's also a Google Drive snafu, and so finding that code might be a little tricky. But we will track it down. Yeah, I mean it's not terribly, but it's mostly R. I mean you have to do some stuff like this primarily in code because it's also something that we did like 10 times to get it right. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Oh.
He had his
I guess
hand up
we
from the
can have
beginning,
one more
but I know we gotta
question.
keep moving.
So I'm curious if you've given much thought to updatability. I think you said
Yes.
this is like a 10-year update?
Yes, it
but
was.
Especially with cities developing bike infrastructure really rapidly in the last decade.
Yeah.
How do you update a map that has a lot of subjectivity in it?
It's a good question. I mean, I think you think of it, well, first of all, I would ask, what I would point to is it's a living document, right? So, other people come in and say, no, this should be different. Okay. You don't just overweigh, one person brings up something, you don't change it, but you treat this as kind of a living text that can be kind of renegotiated. That's one piece. I think, but there has to be a kind of a period to it. These things don't generally work well if they don't have a kind of start and end point. If you're just like, yeah, just give us our comments whenever, one, you're not going to get anybody giving you comments, and two, when do you make a change? So if you say, we're going to open comment period, we're doing another revision of this, you can do it in 2 years. I mean, one of the reasons, honestly, for using ArcGIS Online, I'm not a huge ArcGIS Online fan, but in terms of updatability, it's very user-friendly. You don't have to have somebody learn how to write leaflet code, right, or whatever, or Shiny, or whatever you want to use. Yeah. All right, thank you.